When Mira Desai walked into room 306 of Hartley Hall, no one looked up. It was 5 minutes until class started, and the students were still hunched over phones, sipping coffees, swapping stories about summer internships and class schedules. The usual noise of a first-day morning buzzed low and familiar. Mira didn't say anything at first. She simply stepped inside quietly, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her dark hair tied back, soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. She paused near the chalkboard, checking something on her phone, maybe a schedule, maybe a note. She didn't carry a stack of books, no clipboard, no authority announcing itself, and so the assumption was instant. She must be someone's assistant, a grad student, a TA, maybe a lost new hire from the International Student Office. She didn't look like the professor, and, in most of their minds, she didn't sound like one either. The moment she opened her mouth, that assumption began to show its teeth. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice clear but accented. "Is this English 482? From the front row, a student, tall, baseball cap backwards, legs stretched like he owned the room, glanced at her, then leaned toward the guy next to him and smirked. "Is these English 482?" he said, mimicking her accent with exaggerated vowels, stretching it like a cartoon. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't clever. It was just loud enough for everyone around him to hear, and loud enough that a few others chuckled along. She turned to look at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask him to repeat himself. She smiled, a small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Then, without a word, Mira stepped fully to the front of the room. She picked up a dry erase marker, clicked the cap, and wrote a single word on the board, in sharp, elegant handwriting. "Professor." She turned back to the room. "My name," she said calmly, "is Professor Mira Desai." And for the next 30 seconds, no one in the room could look her in the eye. What she said next wasn't angry. It wasn't petty. It was surgical, gentle, and unforgettable. That day, the lesson began before the syllabus ever left her bag. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9 a.m., the final minute dragging longer than the rest. Students kept filing in, backpacks half-zipped, earbuds in, latte foam still clinging to lips. The room smelled like a mix of fresh paper, worn denim, and the kind of cologne you spray too much of when you're trying to impress someone. Hartley Hall 306 wasn't anything special. Pale walls, gray floors, and rows of uncomfortable plastic desks, bolted to swing armchairs that squeaked when students shifted too much. A chalkboard still hung behind the whiteboard, like a relic the university couldn't bring itself to let go of. To the students already seated, this class, Voice, Culture, and Power in Literature, was just another upper-level elective. A box to tick, a syllabus to skim, another semester to float through, with maybe 1 or 2 decent debates before Thanksgiving break. No one had high expectations, least of all from the professor they hadn't even seen yet. Tyler Langston sat dead center in the front row, legs sprawled, one sneaker resting on the metal bar under his desk. He was what some might call charismatic, others exhausting. Always the first to speak, always the last to realize when he should stop. His confidence was the kind that came easy when you were tall, well-liked, and hadn't yet faced anything that made you question the sound of your own voice. Across the room, his friends kept one eye on him and one on the door. The professor was now officially late, and when Mira Desai stepped in, quiet and unassuming, no one gave her a second glance. Until she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was clear, measured, and softly accented, the kind of accent that still bends toward English, but carries traces of another rhythm, another place. She asked her question politely, and Tyler's smirk bloomed like a bad habit. He didn't need approval to perform, but he got it anyway. A half laugh from the guy behind him, a look from the girl 2 rows back that said she wouldn't say it, but she wasn't going to stop him either. So he mimicked her. Louder, sharper, crueler than it needed to be. It wasn't the worst thing anyone had ever said, but it didn't have to be. It was just enough. Enough to draw the line between you and us, between who belongs and who doesn't. The room laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was easy, because mocking difference is the cheapest form of power, and because no one thought she was anyone they needed to impress. Until she stepped to the board and wrote her name, Professor Mira Desai. There was no tremble in her hand, no spike in her voice, just control, calm, and something else, the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need to announce itself because it's not afraid of being questioned. She turned back to the room. Her eyes didn't seek out Tyler. They didn't need to. They just swept over the space, steady and kind, and rested briefly on every face that had laughed, not to shame them, just to let them know she had seen it all. Then she spoke. I've taught in 3 countries, she said softly. I've studied literature in 5 languages, and I still get told now and then that I don't sound like I'm from here. She paused, just long enough for the silence to settle in everyone's chest. And every time, I remember something a mentor once told me. You only mock what you fear, or what you don't understand. Then she smiled again, not smug, not sarcastic, just warm, unbothered, rooted. She turned to the board and added 3 words beneath her name: voice, culture, power. Then underlined them once, smooth and slow. And that was how the first class began, with no roll call, no textbook handout, just a moment of truth, and a lesson none of them would ever forget. The first class continued, but nothing felt routine. No one shuffled papers. No one whispered. Even the habitual late texters had their phones tucked away, screens dark in their laps. Mira hadn't raised her voice once, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. She moved through the opening lecture with the confidence of someone who didn't care to impress, only to engage. She spoke about narrative power, about who gets to speak and who gets interrupted, about how language has always been a gate, both a weapon and a key. Every word she said was tethered to the real world, and yet, somehow, it felt like she was talking directly to the people in that room. She never mentioned Tyler by name, not once. But the entire time, he sat straighter than he had in any class before. The smirk was gone. His pen tapped softly against his notebook, but his eyes never left her. Something had cracked, not broken, just enough to let something new inside. About 30 minutes in, Mira paused and walked to the board again. She drew a small circle, then another outside of it. In literature, she said, we often study what's inside the circle, the canon, the classics, the familiar, but we rarely ask who drew the circle, and what, or who, was kept outside of it. She tapped the second circle. Accents, culture, gender, skin, class. So many voices aren't missing from history because they didn't exist. They're missing because someone decided they didn't belong inside the circle. A girl near the window slowly lowered her eyes. A student in the back, who had never spoken on day 1 of any class, leaned forward elbows on the desk, and Mira just smiled again. Always that calm, steady smile. The kind that didn't ask for validation. It simply held the room open. When the class ended, students filed out in unusual quiet. Some offered half smiles. A few nodded respectfully. Most said nothing, but their pace had slowed, like they'd walked in, carrying something invisible, and were walking out a little lighter. Tyler stayed behind, lingering near his seat. He looked unsure of himself, the way people do when the joke doesn't land, but the damage does. Mira packed her bag without rushing. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. She glanced up and met his eyes. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. Tyler blinked. "But I should." She shook her head gently. "Not yet. First, you should listen. Then we'll see what you have to say." And with that, she walked out. Not cold, not dismissive. Just complete. She didn't take his power. She refused to give him any more than he had already taken for himself. That was the real lesson, and it hadn't even started with a textbook. Weeks passed, but no one forgot the first day. Mira never brought it up again. She never quoted Tyler's words, never replayed the scene, but the memory of it stayed, suspended in the walls of room 306 like an unfinished sentence. Not heavy, not hostile, just present. And because she never used it against them, it began to work on them from the inside. Mira taught with the same soft authority every class. No dramatic speeches, no performative anger. She guided them through Toni Morrison and Chinua Achebe, through James Baldwin's quiet fury and Arundhati Roy's delicate fire, through literature that didn't whisper apologies for being different. It demanded to be heard as is. One day, she led a discussion on the God of small things, focusing on how children learn silence, how they're taught what not to speak, and who not to be. "You can teach someone to speak English," she said, "but the world will try just as hard to teach them that their voice isn't welcome unless it sounds a certain way." Tyler's pencil stopped moving. Across the room, a Nigerian student named Amaka raised her hand. For the first time in 3 years, she shared how she used to rehearse answers in her head, afraid her accent would ruin her point before it landed. Mira didn't rush to respond. She just nodded. Another student, Min, from Vietnam, followed. Then Karima. Then even Julia, a blonde girl from Michigan, who admitted she'd never realized how much space she was given just because of how she spoke. And still, Mira never mentioned day one, because the room itself had already transformed. Mira's own story came out slowly, through offhand remarks and quiet moments. That she'd grown up in Ahmedabad, reading Dickens by candlelight when the power went out. That she came to the U.S. for grad school at 23, and a professor once interrupted her thesis presentation just to correct how she said the word genre. That she spent 3 years trying to flatten her accent, not to be understood, but to be believed. Until one day, she stopped trying. "Every time I changed my voice," she once said, "I lost a piece of my story. And my story is the one thing no one else can offer this world." By mid-semester, something subtle had changed in Tyler. He didn't try to be the first to speak anymore. Sometimes he didn't speak at all, but he always listened. His posture changed, his language shifted. He stopped correcting people mid-sentence. He stopped looking for laughs. One afternoon, after a seminar on post-colonial identity in literature, he waited until the class cleared out and approached Mira's desk again. He didn't say much, just slid a folded note across the desk. I wrote this after class. You don't have to read it. I just needed to write it. She didn't open it while he stood there. She waited. Let him go. Then, once the room was quiet, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was awkward. The first line had been scratched out and rewritten. I didn't know how much I'd been given by the sound of my own voice, until I saw how easily I used it to take something from someone else. You didn't have to forgive me, but you gave me the space to become someone worth forgiving. Thank you for that. She didn't smile. She closed the note, slipped it gently into her book, and exhaled. Not like someone relieved, but like someone who had seen this before. Someone who knew that quiet revolutions rarely announce themselves. They grow slowly, one sentence at a time, one heart at a time. Years passed. The desks in room 306 were eventually replaced. The whiteboard was upgraded. The paint on the walls changed, but the energy of that room never quite reset. Because some rooms remember. Every new semester, students came in not knowing what had happened in that class years before. They didn't know about the joke, the voice, the silence that followed. But somehow, by the end of each semester, they always knew who Professor Mira Desai was and what she stood for. She was never loud, never flashy. She didn't publish in flashy magazines or tweet thread-worthy lectures. But ask any student who took her class, and they'd say the same thing. She changed the way I hear people. And once you've been taught how to truly hear someone, you don't forget that. Tyler graduated. He went on to teach middle school English in a small town in Oregon, a job he once would have mocked. But now, he stood at the front of his own classroom, remembering the way Mira had held space, not just for knowledge, but for humanity. One day, during a classroom discussion, a new student stumbled over a word. English wasn't her first language. Another student snickered. Tyler's voice didn't rise. He didn't call anyone out by name. He just said, "Around here, we don't laugh at the way people speak. We listen to what they're saying." Then he turned to the board and wrote, "Voice. Culture, power." He didn't explain it, but it was enough. Back at the university, Mira continued teaching, always the same quiet, steady rhythm. Her course filled up every year. Students came early just to sit in the front row, not for easy grades, but because they wanted to be there. She never spoke of the moment that made her unforgettable. She didn't need to. The story had traveled. Not as gossip, but as a turning point. Every time someone laughed at the wrong thing, someone else in the room would shift. A look, a pause, a clearing of the throat. The culture had changed, not overnight, but it had changed. In her final semester before sabbatical, a student raised their hand and asked, "Professor Desai, what's the most important thing you've ever taught?" She thought about it for a moment, then replied, "That the way someone speaks is not a reason to measure them. It's a reason to meet them." That night, she walked through campus slowly. The sun was setting over the quad, and a breeze was running through the trees like a language she didn't need to translate. And in that quiet, she smiled. Not because the work was finished, but because she had planted something, and it was growing. Room 306. New class, new faces. A young student walks in, nervous. Her accent is thick, her English a little uncertain. She asks if she's in the right place. A boy in the front row starts to mimic her under his breath, an old reflex, passed down like a bad habit. Before he can finish, another student turns around and calmly says, "We don't do that here." And that's how legacy works. Not in speeches, not in plaques, but in the quiet things people do because of you, long after you're gone. Professor Mira Desai never raised her voice, but she made sure the world heard her anyway.